Hi everyone, welcome to That's Mental and another episode of Mental Health and the Brain. Today we're going to talk about the neo-limbic part of the brain. And if you remember previously, we talked about the paleo-limbic brain, and basically all of it is part of the limbic system, which is all related to the emotions. In the last video, we saw that the paleolimbic element of the brain is also quite primitive, much as the reptilian brain is, because it relates back to our position in the group, which is society or our friends or our family. Just like the reptilian brain, it has to do with our survival as a species. That's what it's concerned with. It's not so much the stress, fight, or flight response, but it's still to do with survival. The neo-limbic part of the brain, on the other hand, is where our consciousness resides. And I'm going to talk more later in another video about the construction of self. But the interesting thing here is to understand the difference between primitive basic responses such as the fight or flight response and then the consciousness, so awareness, thought process that you're developing along the way over time with experiences and things that you're learning. We spend most of our time in the neo-limbic part of our brain, which is just on as an autopilot pretty much all the time. The really interesting thing for me about this part of the brain, the neo-limbic part or neo-limbic system, is the fact that it has to do with primary and secondary personalities. And the way this relates to our mental health is what I find most interesting. The first very important thing to realize that we also covered in the previous video is that we all have multiple personalities within us. Having multiple personalities doesn't make you crazy or whatever other theory you might have heard or you might have received from the media, from movies, or from stigma around mental health. It's very natural, and as you will see in this video, and thanks to the previous video, it's based on how we were raised, the conditioning that's been around us, and the different forces that are coming into play around us. Because obviously, we are a social species, we live in society, and this is going to very much impact who we are and how we interact with others. So our primary and secondary personalities are developed via what we call intrinsic motivations and secondary motivations, or let's say primary and secondary motivations. Secondary motivations are developed through what's called operational conditioning, which is basically the environment that we grow up in and learned behaviors that we get from others around us. The primary motivations are developed very early on when we are babies. These are at our core. These represent who we truly are. It's basically, if you could imagine, being born with a motivation. Sounds a bit strange, but basically things that you just instinctively like or gravitate towards as a child. Those are the primary ones. The secondary ones, like I said, through operational conditioning, are ones that you're taught by mostly your parents and later your peers in school, etc. The primary motivations, like I said, if you're born with them, they're the ones that come naturally to us. So they give you energy. It's things that you love to do. You don't have to think about it. It just happens naturally. If you try to think about something like this, something that naturally brings you joy, I am sure you'll be able to come up with something in your life, at least one thing. And this is most likely linked to one of your primary motivations. On the other hand, the secondary motivations are more often reward-based. That's because you learned that this was a good behavior or something that you had to do. So you're looking for some positive reinforcement of what you just did, almost as if to validate the fact that you made this choice. Although you may have integrated this behavior now over a very long period of life and it's become natural to you, it's still not a primary one. And therefore, it might be a little more taxing. You might find it more difficult, more mentally draining, or just a little less natural. And that's also why you will be seeking this like reward-based aspect of it to feel good about having done it. So let's give an example of this. What could be a good secondary trait that you gained as a kid? For example, being on time might be one of them. You might have been more naturally spontaneous person. I don't know, maybe you just didn't keep track of time. You just got lost in your activities and whatever. But you were taught by society, by your parents, by school, that being on time was a very important thing. And therefore, maybe now in your life, it's something that you do, it's something that's ingrained in you, but it wasn't your natural inclination. This is a perfect example of a secondary motivation. For example, if you think about it in the reward-based system, this is where you might be seeking for approval or recognition that you were on time and that this was a good behavior and people are happy with the fact that you showed up on time. The interesting thing, like I said, about our secondary motivations costing us more energy sometimes and being more mentally draining, because they might also be in contradiction with who you are or your most primary motivation, like this example of being on time that I just gave. The most interesting thing for me as it relates to mental health is why a lot of us might be feeling this tug of war going on inside of us between our primary and secondary personalities and motivation. I know that I've definitely experienced this in my life, and I know that it can really create a sense of frustration or a struggle within you, and if you don't understand the concept, it's really hard to understand where this struggle is coming from. Why are you feeling so off balance? What is going on, basically. And it can be a real challenge because you can feel torn between doing what you know is right or feels right for you, and then what society expects or your environment expects of you, or what you think is the right thing to do, right? And those two things can sometimes be quite different, what you really instinctively want and what you think is right. And this also creates the extra struggle that I was talking about. It can be really burdensome to have this inner tug of war, and worse still, like I said, if you don't understand why it's happening. And even if you're not fully aware of this internal struggle, this mental struggle, even if you've not realized that you have these different aspects of yourself, it can be really mentally taxing. You might not understand why you're suddenly feeling more exhausted, burnt out, stressed. Maybe it's playing on top of other things that are piling on top of each other, and this is just adding to it. You don't have the awareness of it. It could also manifest itself in other physical ways, for example, physical tension, or you might have stomach problems or whatever it is. Honestly, sometimes it's interesting to know that your body realizes that something's not okay in your mind before you realize it. And these are the physical signs that you're getting, trying to alert you to the fact that something's not right. Another interesting thing that you might be feeling or experiencing is that you might be feeling very misaligned. Now, how can I explain this? When you don't have a lot of self-awareness, maybe you've not done a lot of work on it yet, maybe you've not really determined what are your core values or what it is that drives you, but that doesn't mean that you can't feel that something is off. You can still feel misaligned with what is at your core, even if you don't have it in your full consciousness, as it were. And this will also be a difficult thing to experience. I know that I felt this. If I think back to previous experiences, for example, in my life, and previous jobs that I was in, I know that at the time I was experiencing something difficult and I was unhappy, but it's only now with hindsight that I realized that actually it was very misaligned to who I was and how I like to lead my life. I didn't realize that at the time, but definitely I'm sure this was one of the additional stresses to my situation. This inner struggle is real. It can even provoke some sort of identity crisis, some mental breakdown. Really, it can be a massive burden to carry. And like I said, whether you realize it or not, it can really end up creating, I believe, a lot of mental health issues. What can you do about it? Next time that you're struggling, remember that you have these two different personality traits, these two different sets of motivation within you. Realize that it's not your fault. It's to do with what you learned as a child and how you are in your most natural state. Understand that the two can coexist. I think this is really the most important thing. Don't try to fight the secondary motivations. You've learned them, you've ingrained them, and it has served you in life. But just try to realize that maybe these are not the ones that bring you the most joy. And what can you do about that? It might be that some of the secondary motivations you realize you don't want in your life anymore, they're not serving you, they're making you more stressed. In that case, recognize what they are and then learn to let go of the ones that no longer serve you. Or another thing that you might do is think more about what your primary motivations might be. For example, what are the things that bring you the most joy? Where are the places that are feeling most natural for you to do things, that it's not a struggle to do? And once you realize what they are, try to do more of those things. But remember, it's not a fight. It doesn't have to be either one or the other. They can coexist. They're both valuable and they're both contributing to your personality who you are and how you're integrating and behaving in life. Just remember, it's not your fault, but also as long as you continue to work on it and develop more awareness, you will be able to be more in touch with these aspects of yourself, and it will help you to feel more aligned. Just realize once again, my favorite thing about talking about mental health and the brain, a lot of these systems are ingrained in us and they're just natural systems at play. The thought process, the everything that's happening within our brain that's being transmitted, it's happening without us even having time to realize it. And that's why we cannot always control it, and that's normal. So don't feel bad about it and just take time to really try to be more kind to yourself as well. I think self-compassion in any mental health struggle is really important. And that's why, in my opinion, it helps to understand where these behaviors are coming from, because then you can be more compassionate towards yourself. So the last thing I want to say is, remember, the key is to finding a balance between your primary and your secondary motivations so that you can feel less torn between the two and you can go along having a more natural interaction between both sides of them. So think about it, maybe make a list if you want to, or just spend some time every day asking yourself what was more easy and where was the more of a struggle, and try to use that to guide you more in your life. Thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, come back for another episode of That's Mental and Mental Health and the Brain.